Welcome to Full But Not Finished. I'm your host, Stephanie Michelle, and this is a Q&A episode. I have received so many questions from so many of you on YouTube, on Instagram, through my email for different episode ideas. I appreciate that so much. I don't know when I will get through everything, but I'm trying to do some actual dedicated Q&A episodes like this so that your questions are getting answered. So today I'm just going to start reading. I'm just going to bring up the first question that I have here on my list. And this one's about habits. This is a question I get a fair amount. So the question reads, this actually was from two different people. I've sort of combined the question, but it reads, how do I recognize when I approach food out of habit? I don't want to restrict, but sometimes I feel that I turn to food because this is what I always do if I have the opportunity. And then somebody else, because this came through a comment actually on YouTube, and somebody else piggybacked off of it and said, I'd like to hear more about this too. For example, we eat snacks on road trips. Presumably, that's not a place where my body has felt scarcity or danger, but now, anytime I travel somewhere, I also want to eat. It could just be a habit that doesn't have meaning to my nervous system, but it still feels coded in some way. This came off the heels of the Body Keeps the Score episode, where I talked about how our body remembers past episodes of scarcity or restriction or food as comfort, and it codes it, and then it remembers that, and it's not necessarily acting in a present moment way in the present moment. It's still working off of memories of things it's been through. And so this idea of, habits not being coded from danger or the nervous systems is rooted in the theories that I talked about in that episode. In the past, whenever I've talked about habits, I've struggled to do it in terms of binge eating recovery when we're talking about that compulsion to eat, because I myself had many times thought that I was eating out of habits because a lot of times it looks like a habit. But I find habits an extremely simplistic way of looking at something that's much more complex. There's a book called The Hunger Habit by Judson Brewer, which I reviewed in a different podcast episode. And in that episode, I articulate that anytime somebody is talking about eating through the lens of habit and unwiring those habits, this is also has come up in the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. And I find that these books are often written by men, not always, but there's maybe just a different experience that men have. And I can't speak to that because I'm not a man and I don't know. But there tends to be this clumping in food behaviors with habit discussions. And I don't think they're the same. I don't think that we can talk about food the same exact way that we talk about habits. For example, I had a habit at one time of peeling my nails, like picking at my nails. I had a habit at one time of cracking my knuckles. I even had a habit at one time of drinking soda a lot or coffee a lot, which I'm actually going to talk about today. Breaking those habits, I could use habit frameworks. I could use habit theory. I could use habit strategy. And I did, and it worked. I've recently also decided that I got retainers. I got Invisalign, and I was like, I need to be more diligent about flossing my teeth because I never liked flossing my teeth at night. I always just want to get into bed. And I created this habit for myself of flossing my teeth. I have broken other habits, like I said, and all of that has happened in a relatively, I'm going to say a relatively easy way. It's not easy. It requires a certain amount of, and I'm going to say the word here, it requires a certain amount of willpower, or I'm going to say will, to be intentional about creating a habit or unwiring a habit, because it takes conscious intention. So it takes what we called in occupational therapy school primary energy. It's not an autopilot response. You're actually working upstream. You're going against the path of least resistance to break a habit or to instill one. And so there is a certain amount of will involved in that. But when you're talking about food, there is something different happening. And I think that this piece of the conversation is completely missed when people talk about overeating or binge eating or compulsive eating through a habit lens. If you are somebody who doesn't have a complicated relationship with food, you've not had a history of disorder with it, you've not coded food as a moral experience, you haven't struggled with your body image as it relates to food, then you might be somebody who can use habit theory and habit strategy to eat in a different way. And I give space for that. But most of the people who will be listening to this aren't there. That's not where we're coming from. Many people who are struggling to stop overeating or binge eating are inherently struggling with food. Food has become associated with something more than just what it looks like. That's the premise of the way that I talk about this topic. So let's look at this question of how a habit is formed with food, right? So I was thinking about a time in my life. I had just started dating my husband, and we used to hang out at his apartment. He lived alone, and I was in occupational therapy school, he was in graduate school, and a lot of the time we would, on the weekends, he would have to do his work, I would be studying for school, or I'd be writing a paper. And we got into a habit of going to the Dunkin Donuts near his apartment, and I started getting coffee with half hot chocolate. That was something that made me feel warm and cozy. It was in colder months when this began. It was like a comforting way of sipping this sweet beverage alongside of doing work. And I got into the habit of doing it. And then it started to grow into every time that I ever went into a Dunkin' Donuts, I always ordered the coffee with the hot chocolate. And it got to the point where I was no longer drinking coffee, but I was drinking coffee plus hot chocolate. That was, for all intents and purposes, a habit that I did create. But we have to understand what's going on when we're incorporating food into a routine. So, yes, it's a habit. Okay. But when I'm drinking the coffee, and as I'm doing that, I'm also associating it now with comfort, with helping the emotions that sit next to my instinct to procrastinate, right? Like whenever I have a project to do or a paper to write, like my nervous system gets a little bit like, I really don't want to, like, how can I avoid it? And so that coffee, hot chocolate drink used to be a way that I would manage those emotions. It helped me feel more soothed and got me into the process of writing and doing the work that I had to do in a way that took some barriers down for me. So as that's happening, then I'm coding the coffee and hot chocolate with calming, with regulating, with comfort, with nurturing, with productivity. So now, if I'm like, I think that I'm doing this out of habit, I'd like to stop, I'm not just asking myself to break a habit, I'm asking myself to break the associations of regulation that habit has now gotten coded in. Like that was the thing that helped regulate me. And now it's being taken away. So I'm not just taking away a behavior now, I'm taking away a regulation tool. And I think that distinction is important because when we talk about habits, it sounds simplistic. It sounds like make a habit, break a habit. But when you're talking about what's under the iceberg there and all of the things that go along with taking something away, and I think that concept in particular of taking something away starts to tap into other things beyond just that regulation. So a lot of times when we're talking about let's say we're talking about breaking a habit of eating something, right? And we're thinking about it like was posited in this question. I think I might be eating on road trips just because it's a habit for me to do so, right? So, okay. So we're like, all right, I can really sense that this is a habit and not something that is born of need. I'd like to address it. I'd like to not do that. The reason that this question was framed in such a way that it stated, I don't want to restrict, but I don't want to engage in this habit. The reason that restriction would come up as a thought is because anytime that we take food away from ourselves, even if it's coming from a very present moment, non restrictive place, there are other psychological mechanisms at work that understand the link between and the memories between food and lack of access. So, I'm going to venture to say that like food is one of those things in this world that you really can't get around the fact that it has inherent morality and access versus lack of access and restriction inside of it. We live in diet culture. There's no way to argue that. If you are a person living in the world, you will have run up against the idea of you shouldn't eat that at multiple points in your life. Hundreds, if not thousands of times in your life. You've probably run up against dieting itself, restriction itself. I don't know how many people haven't dieted or restricted in their lifetime. Now, sitting next to everybody's experience of restriction and this idea that we shouldn't be eating something. Already we've got something psychologically going on in the shouldn't, because everybody's going to have a bit of a response to that. Nobody likes to be told we shouldn't or that we can't. There's a natural inner instinct to have some kind of rebel response, whether that becomes up to the surface or it sits inside, right? So there's something about food and should and shouldn'ts that is just there. Sitting next to that, we also have the inherent safety of food that starts the moment that we are born. We exit the womb and immediately the reflex that we've got right then and there, it doesn't take any time to develop it, is the sucking reflex. And we've got that reflex because it's how we eat. It is the most primary thing. We immediately know how to eat. We seek food right coming out, and we eat to survive and we eat to comfort. We eat to soothe. Infants calm when they're eating, when they're drinking, when they're suckling. Like, this is not something that you can do anything about. We have this instinct embedded in our DNA. So now we're looking at, I have a habit that involves food, and I'm looking to break that habit, and that's coming from a non-restrictive place. But we have to be like, well, now that we're asking ourselves to take food away from ourselves, we can't ignore the fact that there's going to be more here than meets the eye when it comes to the subconscious. There's going to be a sense of, hey, is this because I shouldn't? And is this a threat to my autonomy? There's going to be potential memory of food being taken away and the fear of restriction that is coded in the nervous system. And there's going to be a sense of this thing that I equate to safety and comfort is being taken away. And I would say, like, I always use my mom as an example of this because she's not somebody who ever dieted to any pathological degree. Like, she just doesn't have a relationship with food that's highly complicated. It's just medium she's got a pretty typical experience of being a woman in the world, but having not gone to any extremes with that. So when my mom tries to break a habit with food, let's say, she still runs up into challenge because there's still an association of, like, there's still a little bit of resistance about something being taken away. It's not like an easy breezy thing. But when you compound that situation, which even in the best of circumstances is a little bit tricky, with a history of an actual disorganized relationship with food where restriction is a part of that and feeling like food being taken away is a threat, then you're looking at like much more here than just breaking a habit. The reason why I think this is important is because I think that having a greater understanding of all of the mechanisms at play here allows us to have a deeper understanding for what we're really working with. I have had people message me on social media saying that they eat out of habit, these kinds of questions that have come in. And there can be a sense of like, what's wrong with me? Why do I do this? Right. And it's that part of our self perception of like being broken or being faulty or not being strong enough that I think 50% of the time is what's getting in the way. So if we can be able to look more objectively at something and be like, no, yes, this originally got coded for reasons that might have had to do with, like, again, I just started drinking hot chocolate. It wasn't a thing. It wasn't like meant to be a safety coding, but it got coded in. And it speaks to this idea of food being taken away from me when I go to take it away from myself. And it's going to get complicated by my history of taking food away from me when I try to break that. It's managing my expectations around how hard this might be. And managing our expectations is a big part of anything we seek to do for ourselves, because it allows us to understand how much time this might take and how much resistance we might have. All of that said, I do not think that it's impossible to deconstruct a habit that's food-based, even if you have a history of a complicated relationship with food. However, there's some caveats. If we are restricting, this is going to be so much harder because there will be a natural call to protect any and all food that we have. So when you're trying to take something away from yourself and you're also restricting outside of that habit response, your body's going to be primed just to be much more defensive about anything being taken away. But let's say, for purposes of this conversation, that you're not somebody who's actively restricting and that you're just looking to break a food habit. The first thing I want to say is that it's okay for you to do that. There's a lot of talk in this field, and I'm the biggest advocate against restriction. And you know, if you've listened to me for any length of time, it's the number one thing that I talk about. And so you know that I protect, and I understand it to be part and parcel of recovery. And that doesn't mean that any time that we're saying no to food or trying to, for example, break a habit with food, that that's restriction. I also think it's just as insidious to get into a pattern of thinking that you can't ever have any boundaries with food ever because otherwise it's restricting. That is just diet culture like flipped over in a mirror of opposing black and white thinking. It's not helpful to be overly identified and overly fearful of restriction, just like it's not helpful to be overly fearful of eating in diet culture. So I do want to articulate that you're allowed to break a habit that has to do with food without feeling guilty about that. I have done this personally. So in that example, actually, and to be fair, the example I'm going to give is pre-recovery, so it is a little bit different. But I did at some point after I was getting these hot chocolates all the time. I don't remember. I think that I started to feel. I think it was cognitive. I don't think I felt sick or anything. I think I was just like, I feel like I'm drinking a lot of sugar. Like I just, you know, and I'm not going to pathologize sugar either. But it was one of those cases where just from a basic nutritional wisdom standpoint, I felt like I was consuming a lot of sugar. You know, I was like, I'm getting hot chocolates like 2, 3 times a day, and I want to stop. The first thing I did was I named that. I named that there was a habit here that had developed and that I was setting an intention for breaking it. Again, that management of expectations is really important because when I named I'm going to be trying to break this habit, I implicitly understood like that I was going to have to gather some energy to do that because my instinct would be to drink it because that had become the habit. So it does take a certain amount of conscious will to stop doing something. I did the same thing with diet soda, actually. And I say diet soda only because I never drank regular soda, but soda for all intents and purposes. I've also done this with seltzer because seltzer makes me have to go to the bathroom like mad. I don't know what it does, but it makes me have bladder urgency to degrees that affected my life function. So I've had to break habits. Admittedly, seltzer is different because it's not a food necessarily, but I have broken food habits and drink habits strictly from will. And will and willpower they're tricky words and concepts to talk about in this field because willpower and will have absolutely nothing to do with binge eating. And when we're in a position where our body is binging, this is because there is something going on in the physiology and in the emotional landscape of your nervous system that is way beyond what your will can overcome by itself. But when you're talking about a habit, we do need to talk about will. There is intention, there is a rallying of energy that we need to resist an invitation that's just going to pull us this way by nature. There is, and to think about it like energy, where an invitation or a path of least resistance is pulling you this way. To break that habit, we have to pull this way, which is an active process. It requires, and when I say will, I don't mean it colloquially like, yeah, she's so strong. They have so much willpower, like Jim Bro. I'm talking about literally what will is. It's like intent and energetic pursuit of something opposing the force that's pulling on you. Like it's more scientific. You do need that to break a habit. Here's the thing. If you need this will, this amount of energy to break the habit, and you haven't fully deconstructed those other layers underneath, like the restriction layers, the moral associations of food, the cultural imperative of it, the way that our culture discusses food and talks about not eating something or eating something as good or bad. This is another way of talking about mental restriction. And if you still have strong mental restriction going on, strong morality around food, or ideas about should and shouldn't that are still living inside of your body that you're battling, and or you're somebody who needs that calming, that comforting, that your nervous system isn't feeling safe at large. This is often the case with people who are dealing with trauma or who are in high levels of chronic stress. If those things are happening too, that's what's going to take up the energy that you otherwise would be able to channel to your will. So I almost think about having will or having willpower as a privilege. It's something that people can do when they're not heavily burdened by all of that energy being taken up by these other things. Allostatic load means the weight of stress that we carry baseline without ever even getting out of bed in the morning, just the things that are there inside of the body and stressing it out and throwing it out of homeostasis on a baseline level. If you are facing weight stigma, if you are chronically burnt out at work, if you are restricting your food, if you are in a constant battle with your self-critic, if you are financially distressed, if you are in a relationship that makes you feel unsafe or unsatisfied, if you don't feel like you have a sense of your purpose or a meaning in life, if you have anxiety or depression, etc., your allostatic load is already quite high, which means that your nervous system is using a lot of energy just to deal with those things. What's left over might be very minimal and need to be, dedicated to like getting in the shower every day or emptying your dishwasher or parenting your children or just getting to work. Willpower at that point is a luxury. And I think that is so poorly understood when people are like, oh, everyone has 24 hours in a day. When in the fitness culture where they're talking about like, well, I make room time to exercise and you can too. It's like, well, not everybody's dealing with the same 24 hours and not everybody has the same amount of spoons. If you've ever heard about spoon theory, which is a common thing discussed in pain management and chronic conditions that essentially steal energy. So where are we? So we have to look at how high is your allostatic load? What other things are you dealing with where your energy is going? How much of that allostatic load is still compounded by restrictions, physical or mental? How much cultural should and shouldn't is involved in this idea of wanting to break the habit? Where is this really coming from? Those factors are going to matter when it comes to breaking the habit. Exactly. And so if you're like, well, you know what? I have a reasonable amount of stress, but not so much that I don't have any energy to give to breaking a habit. I really have deconstructed my restrictions. I really don't have food morality so much anymore. And I have a relatively okayness. I have relative okayness in my life. I'm not feeling like the need to soothe is overpowering my will. That would be a place where, like to address this from a more straightforward point of view of breaking a habit can be absolutely plausible. And maybe part of this, the person who asked this question is, saying I'm afraid to restrict. I don't want to restrict, but this is happening. I think sometimes that fear of restriction is what blocks us. So we think that by ever saying no to food, that this is a restriction, and it doesn't have to be. This can be an absolutely, and to take your agency back on that. Like it's ridiculous for us to imagine that we can never have any kind of structure with food or no thank yous or maybe later with food because we're afraid of restricting. We're going to end up just as much blocked in and boxed in as we started on the other side of the spectrum with diet culture. So give yourself permission to work on that if this is something that's bothering you, and it will require intent, and it will be hard. Like I think to manage those expectations of it being hard without assuming that just because it's hard, it means you're restricting. I say that very carefully, knowing that I'm talking to hundreds of people, some of whom might be mistaking their restriction for a food habit. And I really need to emphasize this. Not everybody who believes that they're engaging in a habit response with food is. Some people are actually restrictive, and that habit is really the biology asserting itself. And that's going to lean into other podcast episodes that you might want to take a look at regarding the power of restriction and what restriction is really doing in the body to make us eat. That might not be a habit at all. But I also want to give fair dues to those who are struggling with actual habits. If just being able to name that for yourself and give yourself permission to work on that without assuming it's restriction is enough for you, and it might be enough for some of you, then there you go. I mean, sometimes that's all we needed, was to feel like we're not doing anything wrong by acting on our own behalf in this way and being intentional with food. Again, this idea of any kind of intentionality around food can often be mistaken for restriction. But if you find that that's not enough, some ways of exploring this might be, my favorite one is always step one, is naming it and identifying when this happens to you, noticing it, saying like, okay, here I am. And I'll give the example of when I come out of my office every day, no matter how hungry or not I am, I usually reach for an apple or some nuts. And I know that I do that as a way of transitioning out of my office and into my evening routine. It is a habit at this point, but it's also a way that I transition. So I'm okay with it. I don't need to break this habit because I have evaluated that, and I understand here's my cue. My cue is coming out of my office at 4 or 5 p.m. My behavior is going towards the habit of opening my fridge, grabbing an apple, or opening my freezer and grabbing some nuts. So we've identified the cue and we've identified the behavior. And then the next thing is to identify what that habit is serving. What's the safety code? What is the thing that it's doing for our nervous system? For me, in this example, it's helping me regulate the transition from work to evening. At that point, once you've identified what the purpose of the habit is, what it's providing you with, why you wouldn't want to break it. So for example, if I thought about taking that away from myself, I would be left with an absence of regulation during a transition. Is that okay with you? We need to ask ourselves, is that okay with you? On a road trip, for example, you might think it provides me a sense of joy that accompanies a road trip. Is it okay with you to take that particular experience of joy out of the road trip? And by the way, that doesn't mean that you'll be joyless on your road trip. It just means, are you okay with, for a period of time, working through feeling an absence, feeling the lack of a joy regulator during a road trip, which you can say, no, actually, I really like that. That's something that I do enjoy. It is part of the experience. And then we might say, you know what? I'm going to keep this habit. It doesn't bother me. That's what I do. I do with after work. I'm okay with my transition eating. It's okay with me. But if it's something where you're like, no, I don't actually like this, it's really excessive or it really gets in my way, it really makes me feel ill after a while. That's something you say, like, okay, then we want to manage the expectations around this. And we have to understand that to take this thing away might cause some discomfort. And I think that having that relationship with discomfort where we are not afraid of it, because when you change a habit, you will be, for a period of time, you're kind of taking, it's kind of like dopamine fasting. You're going to feel absence. You're going to feel lack as you're not getting that dopamine hit that you expect. That will feel uncomfortable for a while before it starts to feel comfortable. If we can manage our expectations around that and understand, yes, this will feel hard. This will feel like there's an absence of something, there's a missing something, but I'm okay with that. And I have intentionality around that. And I'm going to do this because I want to eventually be able to find my regular baseline of joy or my regular baseline of transitioning or whatever it might be without it. Again, provided that you're eating enough and not restricting, like, you will have to feel uncomfortable. And we don't need to mistake that discomfort for restriction. It is not always. I would also be investigating your motives for that. So if you're saying, I don't want to include food on my road trip because I don't want to gain weight, that is absolutely anyone's prerogative. But to also understand, like, where is the motivation coming from and what are your values around that? I want to put a caveat in here as well to say that, let's say you attempt these things and you find that you get very dysregulated at the thought of it. Like, when you think about, okay, I'm going to make this intention to not take these snacks on my road trip, and then you find that you're binging as a result of that, or you're getting really upset and you're starting to feel like something's really being taken from you. And we're talking about discomfort here, by the way. But if that discomfort starts to exceed or overwhelm your nervous system, that is where I would recommend having more support, whether that's through therapy or coaching or some self-exploratory work around parts or nervous system or somatic work, because where the nervous system is like, hey, I am not okay with this, there's more there. There's more of that safety regulation coding going on than meets the eye. There might be strong parts of us and strong dysregulation around this idea of something being taken. I find this concept comes up a lot with clients. I have a client who we talk about parts, and her part is the entitled part. And she has this part of her that she says feels entitled to absolutely everything, even beyond reason, in her words, because she cannot tolerate the feeling of injustice. She cannot tolerate the feeling of something not being fair or not having access to anything and everything at all times. This is a child part for her. So this comes from a history. And again, when we look at story, we usually end up uncovering these layers of like, okay, when we were young, there was an absence of permission around X, Y, and Z. There was an absence of access to X, Y, and Z. And that inner part is still very, very strongly protecting something right now. And if that's happening for you, this is not a simple case of breaking a habit. There might be more there. And I'm not saying that in a way to scare you or to condemn you to like a lifetime of having to follow that inner child part. But there's ways of, I think that this would, more than a podcast can offer here, there would be ways of approaching this that would be a bit more intricate than just a step-by-step reframe. As a tool, though, there, I might start with regulating the nervous system. So let's say in this example that we are going on the road trip and we're like, I'm going to get gas, but I'm not going to get the snacks. And we find like the heart's racing or there's the teeth are gritting and the jaw's getting tight. That would be a time to come towards the body and to help the body feel safe in that moment, because what's happening there is there's a dysregulation occurring in response to this lack of access that is likely inspiring old stories. And wherever you've got old stories coming up, which is anytime you're getting triggered, that's a call to the body. So you want to go directly there. I put my hands on my chest. I breathe. I pay attention to the sensations swirling in my head, my shoulders, my muscles, my stomach, my chest space, exactly where my hands are. And I sit there for a little bit and I just wait with that. Because essentially, you're being activated into a stress cycle of something's being taken away from me. And what we want to do is be present with that part that's coming up. And we want to guide it towards a safe resolution. So we want to allow that trigger to rise and that emotion to rise. And then we also want to hang out with it as it stays there without rushing into behavior, because the behavior or the symptom is what's going to take us out of it and short circuit the stress cycle completing itself. And let that fall back down, all with our own presence. So there may be, this is where I think somatic work is really helpful to being activated into this sense of like, I want it, I don't want it taken from me. And to sit longer with the part of us that's like, what's happening for us? What's happening? This is really stressful. Like, this is really stressful. And to wait until we get to the other side of that stress so that at least that nervous system code is learning, there's a way to move through this trigger without moving into symptoms or without completely abandoning myself. Safe landing. Interesting. Haven't been here before. And the more that we're practicing that safe landing, the more we're teaching our nervous system the experience of this trigger having a safe landing. I will also say that a lot of times with clients, what I will recommend doing is having the food, is doing that exact practice I just named and eating alongside of it so that we're not in so much overwhelm, that it feels truly like we're being like re-triggered or re-traumatized into feeling that sense of scarcity and deprivation. The subject of habits has many books written on the topic. I am sure there are many podcasts and blogs in the field of intuitive eating and binge eating recovery and body image that discuss food habits in multiple ways. This was my perspective today. Please let me know if there's other angles of this that inspire you or that you're thinking about, or maybe if you have questions about a particular segment of this episode. And I will see you again for another Q&A. I don't know when, actually. I was going to say 5 weeks, but maybe. I'm really hoping to get through everybody's questions over time. Thank you for sending them in, and I will see you next week.